This is a new series on consanguinity in the Bible, and it's going to be a shorter series because I'm going to try to condense most of the content into fewer episodes and fewer videos. So let's start at the beginning. The basis for this series is going to come from Leviticus 18, specifically verses 6 through 17, which cover prohibitions against marriage and sexual relationships within family structures. Much of the ancient Israeli society was a civilization that was built on clans of different families that formed tribes by marrying from within their own clans. And the Leviticus 18 regulations made sure that any marriages that took place from within one's own clan did not take place between close, immediate family members. And Leviticus 18 helps us define what those boundaries are. I'm not going to read the entire passage in this video. I expect the listener to familiarize him or herself with it, but I would like to point out a few things that are worth noting. First of all, you'll notice I referenced verses 6 through 17 as speaking to consanguinity laws, and I didn't include verse 18 or afterwards. There are some in the Christian community who believe that verse 18, with its reference to having two wives, because it follows on the heels of prohibitions concerning incest, that therefore verse 18's reference to two wives should therefore also be considered incest as well. I disagree with this interpretation. While I do think it's valuable to invest some interpretation into the order that certain verses are placed in the Bible and the order that they appear, I think it's too much of a stretch to build your entire ethical compass or your theology using verse order as your foundation alone, because that will quickly land you in all manner of tenuous and contradictory inconsistencies. This claim that verse 18 should be understood as a prohibition against consanguinity makes the mistake of putting all their hermeneutic eggs in the one basket of order in which verses appear or are written, and it's a position lacking substance in my opinion. Furthermore, there are already narratives in the Bible that help us understand exactly what verse 18 is getting at, and it's not consanguinity, but I've already covered a more in-depth look at Leviticus 18:18, and you'll find that video as episode 16 in my Concubines, Wives, and Biblical Law series. Now, if you haven't familiarized yourself with Leviticus 18 yet, then these references to verses that I'm making are going to be, nebulous to you. You're not going to understand what I'm referencing. So I would encourage you to read Leviticus 18 so that you know what I'm talking about. Again, I'm trying to make these videos probably a little bit more shorter, so I'm moving through it real quick here. But reading through this chapter, also forces us to remember that there are several awkward moments in biblical history that we know about which seem to be in violation of these laws in Leviticus 18. For example, did Father Abraham really marry his sister? What about Noah's small family on the ark after the flood? What about the children of Adam and Eve? And several other questions that I notice are not really addressed satisfactorily by many in the church. And so I thought it would be appropriate to make a series on these things and answer these questions. One of those awkward issues is the episode in Genesis chapter 9 when Ham sees the nakedness of his father Noah. Now, this particular story is not one that has been ignored. In fact, there has been ample study and debate over exactly what is happening in this chapter, because the text makes it slightly difficult to understand everything that's going on. But, even though it's been covered by many, I think it falls under the category of this series that I'm going into, so I'm going to include it as a topic for this episode. A plain reading of the text would indicate that Ham saw his father in a vulnerable, drunken, and naked state, laughed at him, and wanted his brothers to join in his ridicule. And I think that's a fair reading of the text. I don't disagree with the interpretation at all, but I started getting suspicious when more modern interpretations started understanding the text as being that Ham had a physical sexual encounter with his own father, and this is why Noah was so upset at Ham, and his brothers were so ashamed of him. Well, I don't want to immediately be too dismissive of new interpretations of biblical texts. This one seemed like too much of a stretch to me. It's almost as if people started pushing the envelope too far, in my opinion. It's almost like people believe this based on the fact that they thought Noah's curse on Ham was too harsh for simply having a laugh at his father. And so those interpreters felt motivated to find a darker reason behind why Noah's curse of his son was so severe. Again, I think this pushes the envelope too far. It certainly hasn't stopped the interpretation from growing in popularity among Christian circles, though. While I kind of understand, I guess, the concern of the severity of the curse on Ham being disproportionately more severe than the offense of laughing at his father might merit, I also prefer it, though, as a valid interpretation over this other interpretation, where not only does its formulation come from nothing else other than a motivation to make sense of the severity of a curse, but it also ends up making the curse punishment disproportionately light compared to the severity of the crime it says was committed. I heard one broadcast from the late and great biblical scholar Michael Heiser, who put his 2 cents in on this passage, and he ends up making the curse, I found myself leaning more and more towards his way of seeing things because it had more biblical ammunition than these other interpretations did. I'll post his broadcast in this series playlist as episode 2, so you can listen to the whole thing. That way I'm not reinventing the wheel. While I myself am still open to new interpretations on this chapter, I do find myself feeling resolved in Michael Heiser's take on the matter, where he pulls from Leviticus 18 for his interpretation. You'll notice as you read through Leviticus 18 how after certain prohibitions are being stated, they're followed up with a reason. For example, when it says, "You should not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife, for this is the nakedness of your father," or "You should not uncover the nakedness of your father, for it is your mother's nakedness." I think part of what these reasons are pointing out is that if you violate these rules, not only are you in rebellion against God, but you would be violating the person who rightfully owns that nakedness in the first place as well. Your father's nakedness belongs to your mother. Your mother's belongs to your father. To violate one is to violate the other. And this understanding plays a key role in helping us to understand what's happening during moments of biblical history when the narratives are not as clear as we would like them to be, such as in Genesis 9, where Ham uncovered the nakedness of his father Noah. Because of Leviticus 18, this can be understood as Ham uncovering the nakedness that belonged to Noah, namely Noah's wife. I think there's room for disagreement on this still about what actually took place in Genesis 9, but I find myself being drawn to Michael Heiser's interpretation, if only for the fact that he lets Scripture interpret Scripture in his approach to the Bible. And that's one I try to employ as well on this channel. I'll post his broadcast as the next episode in this series, and then I will continue this series covering other moments from biblical history to help us understand if the saints of the Bible were guilty or not of violating certain consanguinity laws of the Bible from Leviticus 18 as we go through this series.